Op 29 februari en 1 maart in Rij Amsterdam is de nummer 1 developer conference ter wereld, DevWorld.
Wij van de Nederlandse Kubernetes podcast zijn er ook bij. Gebruik de code podcast DevWorldFriends voor 30% korting.
Mis het niet. Hey Jan, wij zijn nu al een tijdje bezig met onze podcast en de onderwerpen over Kubernetes raken maar niet op.
Ja, super tof toch? Het mooie is dat de open source ontwikkeling maar blijft doorgaan en je continu kan blijven leren.
Nou, bij ACC ICT zijn ze voortdurend op zoek naar Kubernetes enthousiastelingen die juist graag willen doorleren.
Ga naar werkenbij.accict.com en word een Kubernetes hero.
Welkom bij een nieuwe aflevering van de Nederlandse Kubernetes podcast. De podcast over Kubernetes voor iedereen. Ik ben uw gastheer Ronald Kers en met mij is zoals altijd natuurlijk...
Hi Ronald. Zoals
de
normaal.
enige echte Jan Stomphorst, zoals normaal. We hebben echt een hele toffe, super toffe aflevering deze keer. En de primeur is, dit is ook de eerste keer dat we hem online hebben.
Ja, het is weer een beetje anders hè, om hem online te doen. Meestal doen we het gewoon met elkaar in een ruimte, wat ik persoonlijk heel leuk vind altijd.
Vind ik ook, maar deze gasten maken we er graag een uitzondering voor. Our guest today is Mark Mandel from Google Cloud. Welcome Mark.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I have no idea what you just said when your introduction was there, but I assume it was good, so well done.
It was very good. So, for the people who don't know you, can you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Absolutely. So hi, my name is Mark Mandel. Depending on whether I'm using my Australian or American accent. But yes, I'm an Australian, lives in San Francisco. I am tech lead for developer relations for gaming on Google Cloud. I'm one of the founders on Agones, which is the open source project we're talking about today, as well as one of the founders of another one called Quilkin, which we may end up chatting about. I have a pretty long history working in open source, both in general web tech and now primarily in gaming. And yeah, that's me. I'm super passionate about just education around backends for gaming and helping people build out backends for multiplayer games.
Cool. How long have you been working with Kubernetes? Do you recall the first version you utilized in your project?
That is actually a really good question because I've had arguments with friends about this. The reason is that, okay, so according to a good friend of mine, she says that I was ranting about Kubernetes pre 1.0 before I joined Google, which I don't particularly remember, but sounds like something I would actually do. And my memory is not the best. So I've definitely been working with Kubernetes pre 1.0. I'm not even sure what version it is. I would say the first experience I had was when I'd first joined Google. One of my wonderful teammates, Brian Dorsey, was doing a workshop with Kubernetes for the day. And he was like, do you want to be a teaching assistant? Do you want to come help me? And I was like, cool, I'm going to sit down and we're going to work out pods and services and deployments and we're going to get this done. And so I did that overnight. And the next day we went and ran a workshop together for like 15 people. But it was like, yeah, like super
nice.
pre 1.0. Super pre 1.0.
How did you do, just for myself, how did you do the networking in the early days?
Early days, we had GKE on Google Cloud, so cloud privilege. I didn't have to do a lot of the heavy lifting there. So it was relatively straightforward for just general web tech kind of stuff. It was just like install GKE, off you go, and then let's just put stuff on it. So I believe if I remember correctly for that workshop, we spun up, Google Cloud projects for people and just let people, cut loose on them for a while and tear them down at the end.
You had it easy.
Yes. Yes.
You had it easy.
Yes. Cloud privilege.
We've heard other stories.
Yeah. No, didn't go through Kelsey's the hard way. Nothing like that. I was like, nope, that's another person's problem. I will just use the thing that makes my life easy.
Yeah. Great. Can you share some details about your most remarkable project you've undertaken while using Kubernetes?
I mean, that's probably Agones, really. I think is probably the most exciting thing I've done, and we can go deep on that. But I will say the thing that got me so excited about that, if anyone's done work with the extensible nature of Kubernetes, custom resource definitions, API services, validation and mutation webhooks, like the extensibility of Kubernetes is just really hugely powerful and kind of a testament to what we've been able to achieve with it with the project that we're working on. And so like that, I think that for me is the thing that got me really excited, and probably I found some really weird bugs in Kubernetes. extending out Kubernetes in some
What
interesting
kind
ways.
of bugs?
Oh.
He can't sit still anymore, so you've got him.
I found some interesting bugs. Most recently, I found a panic in kubectl in version 127. So we do API extensions, so API services. So if people aren't familiar with that, very much like pre-custom resource definitions. If you wanted to extend the API surface for Kubernetes itself, you can do that through an API service, an API extension. And it's basically a proxy layer, right? Like a message comes in to the Kubernetes API and it gets redirected back to your endpoints. So you basically have to do like all the work from top to tail. We have one of those for reasons, and we can get into that. But yeah, there was some code in the kubectl stuff that expected certain stuff to come back from certain endpoints that we had never implemented because they were new or recently new, and the whole thing fell over. So we reported it, got it fixed. It's fine. But yeah, I found some odd stuff in places.
Awesome. And your greatest project is Agones. What is Agones?
What is Agones? Okay, so let's set some foundation and talk a little bit about multiplayer games and how often they get built and some of the patterns they're in, and then we can talk about Agones and how it solves that problem. Does that sound cool?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so this is, and I'll preface this with, this is one way to do this type of workload. There are others. They each have pros and cons. That could be a whole other podcast episode. But when we look at sort of your very fast-paced, interactive, often competitive multiplayer games, right? We're thinking of, I'm not speaking on other people's behalf, but like games like a Fortnite or an Overwatch or
Fall Guys?
Rocket League, or the finals that came out recently in your part of the world. What often have is what's commonly referred to in the industry is probably like a dedicated game server, although sometimes it gets shortened to game server. That game server gets overloaded a bunch. I try and use the word dedicated game server or authoritative server. Basically, what that means is, say the three of us are playing a game, right? We would all connect our game clients up to this dedicated game server that, in this particular instance, would live on the internet somewhere in the cloud, for example. And it's the job of that dedicated game server to be the authority of everything that's happening in the game. So say we're driving around a racetrack and I'm sort of going this way and you're going that way. Its job is to be like, okay, let's do all the physics simulation in memory and keep track of what everyone's doing and basically pass that information down from the clients as it goes up and like do all the calculations and pass it back down with some magic and some wizardry. And we can talk about that sort of stuff if you want to. Some lies and magic and fun. Because time is relative and all kinds of weird stuff happens. But basically to be that authority and send that information back down to the players. And there's a couple of good reasons for doing this. So one of which is latency requirements. So typically, and again, it varies, like 50 milliseconds away from the players is about your sweet spot. Some games can go up to about 200. Again, depends on the game, what you're doing. But being able to geographically place where your dedicated game servers are around the world means that you can control the latency, right? If I was playing with you, you're in Europe, I'm here in the US. It depends on where the pipes are and which networks we're going over, but that's fun. It might be best if we were playing on maybe somewhere in like New York or depending where your data centers are, that kind of stuff, or maybe somewhere in the middle of like maybe Germany. I come across the pond, depending on your latency metrics. But having that control of geographic location means you have control over latency. It also means that if you're putting it in the cloud, you have control over hardware, so you know exactly where it's going to run and what's going to run on. And also, people do bad things. They do bad stuff. They just do bad stuff. So if you hand someone a client, a piece of software that they can run that is the game, ultimately you can't trust it. So making the client authoritative is a tricky proposition. And that's again a whole other conversations. But having basically an authoritative server in the cloud mitigates some of those issues because you control that authority, and then you can decode what's going on inside the world. Okay, so that's the long-winded multiplayer game conversation.
Just clarifying for the audience. So Agones is a way to run your multiplayer games.
Yes. Yeah. So so the whole point of Agones is about running these kind of game server workloads. And you could even extend that to what I've commonly come to kind of term and a bunch of other people that have also used it as kind of in-memory stateful workloads.
Okay.
Which I think is an important distinction, right? So if we're playing a game together, in memory, we are playing that game together. It's in memory in that authoritative server. The whole state of the game is in there. It's super fast, super computationally heavy. So we can't like offload that to another system. We can't do like that wonderful stateless web kind of thing. Like that's not a thing.
No.
Which is just so convenient when you can do it.
Yeah, kill the container and then move on.
Yeah, exactly, right? You've got 10 web servers running. You kill one, not a big deal, right? If you've got all of us playing a game and you kill that container, we're all going to go on Reddit or Twitter or Mastodon or whatever everyone's using and be like, I had a bad experience. I don't like it. This game sucks, right? So we don't want that. We want to have good player experiences. So Agones does a bunch of stuff around like tooling around for stuff. The primary thing that it really does and optimizations around this is that if you have players playing on a game, don't interrupt that session because it's in memory stateful. And we do a bunch of optimization work and we do a bunch of other things that are just like super handy for how communication happens as well, which is again slightly different. But the core promise is we have this idea of game server and fleet. Those are our resources. We have this kind of declarative thing called allocation, which is like, go give me a game server that matches this criteria and mark it as allocated so that then we know that it has players on it. But then I can scale my fleet up, scale my fleet down. I can auto scale my fleet. I can roll out new versions of my game server across the fleet without any fear that I'm going to interrupt an in-player session because it is marked as allocated, which means that players are on it. And therefore I can kind of orchestrate my game servers at scale without that fear of interrupting player sessions. That's sort of the big draw. I'll pause there.
Well, we can hear you are deep in the material. So.
I live and breathe this, right? Like, and sometimes I can't see the forest from the trees, and that's fine. But like, I think that's, and if you wanted to almost think about it another way, like we see the similar patterns in other places, in other industries. Like we're here on a Zoom call. I don't know how Zoom does their stuff, but like we see the similar things in like VoIP and whatnot, where like, yeah, everyone connects to a single point quite often. It's running like some sort of voice server. Like while this conversation is going on, we have to have a single point, or one of the patterns for doing that is to have a single point to be able to transfer this information, maybe to transfer video streams and other kind of stuff. So it's a very similar kind of platform and very similar kind of workload. But we focused on games. We focused on games because it gives us a point of focus.
Of course, just to go back on the latency. So you can, how do you, just thinking about, know where to put your server or your workload?
Yeah. That is a good question. So the short answer is to start with, guess. Which is like the fun part of games is you don't know how many players you're going to have at launch and you don't know where they're going to be.
Yeah.
So you're going to need to adjust over time. So to start, you will, again, you'll make some estimates on how many players you think are going to show up.
You've got a maximum sometimes in games.
Yeah. So a usual best practice that I actually really love when scaling games is actually having a upper bounds player throttling count, right? Like once we hit this amount, then we don't let any more in, and then maybe we can expand that over time. I actually really like that as a thing. It's like basically a rate throttler on an API.
Wow.
But you would probably put like a few clusters, again, depending, one or more clusters in like US, one or more clusters somewhere in Europe, one or more clusters somewhere in APAC, again, depending, and then adjust over time. Agones does come with some basically like their ping services, latency recording services. They're literally just echo points. So that when you are matchmaking your game, part of what you will actually do is send pings out to all the locations that you know about and the regions where you have your game servers hosted, so you can track that information and send that as part of your matchmaking request. So usually your game's going to have like a latency SLO, like what server's level objective, right? Like my game can run at 100 milliseconds or less, for example. And therefore that'll be part of your matchmaking and how you place your players. And then you'll be like, okay, these players need to go here in this region. So that's where I'm going to allocate from and grab a game server. And that's where my players will go so they have a good experience.
So you're with players in the lobby, and just like Fortnite. Fortnite starts in the lobby, and then you'll start a server somewhere where the ping is okay for everybody.
Yeah. So depends how you matchmake as a game. That's a whole other conversation. But yeah, so usually you will have multiple Agones clusters around the world. And yes, depending on your latency information, you will decide which region that you or data center, or depending on how specific you want to get and how many clusters you have, you will then specify, okay, this group of clusters over here, they're the ones, in the region that I have where I have my Agones clusters. That's where I want to put my player. I'll do an allocation to one of them, assuming it has some capacity. It'll return one back to you and be like, yep, you got one. Here's your IP and port. This is where you need to send your information. And that's where all your clients can connect.
Awesome.
So I was thinking, we're talking about mostly like the examples now are the multiplayer game, the short matched, let's say, the shoot 'em ups. But there are also games that are a longer stretch. Like, let's say, I see the postcard behind you. I think it's Sea of Thieves, but I don't know if it's the correct one.
I've forgotten, to be absolutely honest. I have a bunch of them.
I can see when you have multiple servers running at one location or multiple location, is it possible and one server is being drained or somehow, or where people are leaving and you're the only one on the server? Is there a way that those can merge with the other, running your session with the other servers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say for like the Agones project itself, that is a decision that is up to the end user about how they want to do that. Ultimately, we're an orchestration platform. So we spin up game servers, we spin down game servers. We do have some facilities in our system to do stuff like notify game servers. There's actually an integrated SDK that comes with the Agones system that you can need to, in some capacity, put into either a game server binary or integrate it in some way. But we do have ways of doing things like through that SDK, like, hey, a new update has come through. You're a long living game server, either session, maybe you're doing repeats, or like a lobby server or an MMO type situation. Hey, there's a new version. You might want to actively drain or actively scale out. So that, and then kick that process off, maybe punt users out, they fall back into their matchmaking pool and then they go back. Maybe there's a notification, something like that. So ultimately we provide the tools for if and how you might want to do that, but we leave that as an exercise for you because it's probably game dependent anyway.
Okay. Well, if you explore the distinction and commonality between software development and game development, is there some overlap there?
Yes. Controversial statement. I would say there's more overlap than most game developers want to admit to.
Yes.
I'll write again. That would be my statement.
I have my bingo card right here, So,
but I would say there's also differences, and it really depends.
Sure.
So, I think one of the big differences is development cycle. So you're looking at 2-3 years to develop a game. Quite often, what you see is technical decisions get decided early on, and they don't necessarily change down the path, right? So, what we would commonly inside the wider tech world be thinking of like technical debt and like maintenance tasks and day 2, day 3 operations, unless that game is a hit and lasts for a while, those sort of considerations are not nearly as important. Games are a hit-driven business. You're not going to, generally speaking, I would say in this industry, you don't see the sort of iteration that you would have. Like, I have a startup and then we created a thing with like the least viable product and like it didn't quite work. So now we're pivoting. That doesn't happen nearly as much in games. You see it on occasion, but it's pretty rare. It's kind of, we made a game. Is it going to be a hit? No, it's not. Okay, let's move on to something else. Try it all over again and roll. So it does make things different from that perspective. And also there's, what's the word I'm looking for? So that's definitely a part. Sometimes I feel like the teams are smaller, but that may just be like the perspective I see.
For software development or
for game development. Yeah. But that could be my bias. I could own that, but I definitely I can see scenarios where small groups of people support like really large player bases. And sometimes that just also means that like we picked a way and it works, so we're sticking with it and it's fine. Let's move on. Let's make it. Let's focus on making the game. So that's definitely a thing as well. So there are differences.
But a game has also attackers and software bugs and.
It does, yeah. So there's some of that too. So a lot of that stuff is very similar, right? But what was I going to say? The thing that makes it tricky as well is also the iterative cycle of finding fun, which can also be an interesting thing because you are throwing out as much as you put in. And so there is this trade-off where if we look at things like continuous integration and continuous deployment, right? Let's write a ton of unit tests for this so that we know that it's rock solid, blah, blah, blah. And so you do have to kind of pick your poison a little bit and decide, like, do I just hack up this thing so we can test to make sure this bit is actually fun and then do it right? Or do I do it right? But then they're like, oh, but it's actually not fun. No one wants it. And you spend all this extra time. There are pros and cons with that make it kind of difficult. Whereas I think if you're doing sort of iterative development for an application, especially when you have a close relationship with your customer base, you can have that conversation where you're like, okay, we've given you a minimal viable product. Let's like sit in front of it and then like work out what the next step is. Maybe you're doing like an agile process or something. That it does come out a little different. There's some art to it that I don't know if you necessarily find in other places that, and that's to say that like wider tech stuff is bad. It is just different in that aspect, but also the same. I mean, if you're building out an infrastructure platform, then yeah, you end up doing like continuous integration, continuous deployment kind of stuff.
Yeah,
So
actually automated
that is-
test pipelines also
Yeah.
for game servers, so for
Absolutely.
games. So
Which is actually super cool stuff. But then you're like, okay, we need to automate that this player can scale down every wall that is in the entire world. And how do we do that inside our game engine kind of stuff? But I will also say the one big thing that I think is different is launches, because you don't know how many players are going to show up. You can
No, of course
guess,
not.
but
You can guess, yeah.
be horribly, horribly wrong, or like a wonderful success
we can
or a
name
horrible
we
success.
can name the examples. Where we have
And
it.
there are so many, right? And there are absolutely so many, and it's a good problem to have. But it is also that thing where you're like, well, if we mess up launch, then like a bunch of people are going to go away, and they may never come
Yeah.
back. We may miss out on a bunch of money. So there are that complications there as well. You can do private betas, you can do open betas. You can try and mitigate that to a degree, and it's good. You should absolutely do that. But yeah.
Still they get surprised. I remember
Well, yeah.
the Diablo 4 launch, for example, the queue was insanely long at launch. day.
Right. Or you see stuff like, I mean, like Among Us could never have known that COVID was going to be a thing, and it was
Yeah.
just going to hit that
That's the thing,
zeitgeist
yeah.
and just take off.
Or Pokemon Go.
Sometimes, yeah, Pokemon Go just captured that lightning. Was just,
Yeah.
I mean, that was amazing. Or even sometimes it's just, some you get a popular streamer, they just hit something and they make something that people are aware of, either an event or content or something that happens in a game, and
Yeah.
suddenly you get that spike, and that can be tricky.
So if you want to install Agones, what are the logical steps? Is it just you can download the repository for Agones and just run it on
Helm
your
install.
cluster?
Helm install,
install.
Helm repo
Okay.
update, or Helm repo add Agones repo, and then Helm install Agones. That's
Easy.
really it. I mean, we have a YAML file you can use, but the Helm chart gives you like way more configurable options. If you want to run it through something like Customize, you can as well. Absolutely done that. But yeah, just Helm install. Installs all the
Okay.
CRDs, installs all the controller pods and all their extensions and stuff that runs in that. And yeah, just take it from there.
Cool.
Easy.
So-
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, Jan, do you have something to add to this?
No.
Oh, okay.
But
Then I'll go to the next
installing
question.
is easy.
Bij ACC ICT staat alles in het teken van continuïteit waarborgen voor bedrijfkritische applicaties. Of het nu gaat over Managed OTAP, Cloud en Kubernetes, ze geven hier invulling aan om door samen met hun klanten een toekomstbestendige strategie uit te stippelen voor het gehele proces van ontwikkelen tot en met productie.
Aside from Agones, are there other tools in your arsenal that you'll find particularly valuable? For instance, how does Quilkin contribute to your workflow?
Yeah, Quilkin's an interesting project. Super proud of that. I mean, it's credit as well, like Agones history. We initially started that with Ubisoft, and then we've had a bunch of other game companies that have come through and helped us. I think it's over 100 now, or 100 people, I should say. I don't know if it's 100 companies, but we've had a variety of game studios come through. Quilkin's a project that we started with Embark Studios, who are also amazing, and a huge history of open source work. Quilkin's an interesting one in that I refer to it as the service mesh for game servers. So I
Interesting.
think it's fairly accurate. So actually, let's talk a little bit about game server communication.
I'm
So
going to sit straight. Yeah. Go ahead.
so traditionally speaking, or I would say generally speaking, most game server communication is UDP based.
Yes.
There are a variety of reasons for that. Short answer is if you're running, it's fast, right? If you're running a TCP thing, a TCP connection, and like you drop a packet, it has to go all the way back, grab the packet, and send it all over again. It's going to wait. By the time that happens, usually you just don't care anymore in a game. Things have moved on far enough. So usually you're sending UDP packets, and that's a whole other conversation. Is good. I can send you links to articles. That also means that when you're talking to a game server process, and this is true for Agones, you generally talk directly to it, right? You're not going through a load balancer. You're not sending it somewhere else because you've got, like, say, the three of us are playing a game. We all need to connect to this game server.
Yeah.
So usually you get an IP import, and we all connect to that IP import, and we all play a game, right? For Agones itself, actually, we give you a container host port. We manage that for you, that port management for you. That's something special that Agones does as well. But that also has some challenges. Primarily, again, people aren't very nice. I don't know if you've noticed this sometimes. I mean, generally speaking, you all are lovely, but some people are not very
Thank you
nice.
very much.
And if you expose information to the internet, they may do nefarious things to it. So
Yeah,
whether it's trying to access that port, DDoS, just do things that they probably shouldn't do, especially if they're at games and they're like, I'm losing. I don't want to lose. So if we can find ways to information hide, spread load, all that kind of good stuff that we've probably seen in a bunch of other places, that's like, yay, awesome. And so proxies, right? We've talked about like that's just a common thing, whether it's, running, I don't know if it's old school anymore, but like running varnish cache proxies in front of stuff so that you can spread the load of web servers to like we see things like Nginx and Trafic and Envoy and like all this kind of other really cool and interesting stuff that have come in the more recent years. So it becomes an interesting problem in the games industry because we don't have the nice things of like HTTP or gRPC or anything like that. There's no
WebSockets.
I mean, there are WebSockets. That is a thing. If you're doing HTML games, that's a thing. Or like some mobile games will use WebSockets. But for the vast majority of like PC console games, like it's just the only thing you can really rely on is that you get a UDP packet. And if you're not as familiar with UDP as I am, that means you get an array of bytes. There's no like nice HTTP header. There's no like routing information. There's no like standard for this. So like that is all you get. And so Quilkin is a project specifically for routing and manipulating UDP packets when the only assumption you have is that it is an array of bytes. But you still want to do things like access protection. Does this player have a token? Where should that token go to? If I get rid of that token, should they be blocked? Maybe I want to do manipulations. Maybe I want to compress. Maybe I want to expand.
But is that token
normal proxy things?
Anyway, is that token then in the packet?
That token has to be in the packet. Now, where is it in the packet? You have to tell me as part of my system, right? Because again, no standards. But it does mean that so Quilkin's a Rust-based project that is a UDP proxy that can be run actually in a variety of configurations, very much like Envoy, right? And any sort of like if you're running it as part of a service mesh, like something like Istio, or just running on its own and you're managing and configuring its own. Quilkin is very similar, but Quilkin also has integrations with things like Agones as well to help with the management layer. But ultimately, what it is doing is providing those things like access control, rate limiting, routing information. You can send packets to multiple places. You can start doing some more sophisticated stuff. So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, could you use this for streaming also?
Ultimately, at the end of the day, as long as there's a UDP packet going through, you can do what you like with it. It has basically endpoints. Where can you send stuff? And it has filters. So for manipulation and routing, and we can extend that. That's not too bad. So yeah, if you want to do routing of packets to a variety of places, like, hey, mirror packets to 2 or 3 spots, you could do that. Yeah. And we also have like logic filters. Like if you have different versions of the packet with different like parts of the packet show which version of it, you can then set up different filters based on as your communication protocol changes over time. There's lots of fun stuff in there. But yeah, sorry, I was going to. Sorry, again.
Cool. I was just thinking about what could that be for solutions. How could I use it?
Yeah, so the very common use case for this is primarily about routing access control. So the common scenario would be something like, okay, we're all playing a game. As part of the matchmaking process, we all get given a short token, like it'd be like a 12 bytes, 18 bytes, depending on how unique you want to be, cryptographically secure in theory. We all get a short token. And as part of the game client, whether running Quilkin is a binary next to your game client, or as part of we have some integration, like we have an Unreal SDK that you can use as well, or just doing it yourself. It's again, just appending bytes to a packet. You add that token to your packet as it comes through. Instead of having an IP import, like we would do here, where like, hey, here's an individual IP import from my particular game session, you would probably have a load balancer IP, or maybe even a series of proxies. There's pros and cons therein. that you send the traffic to. That traffic going to those proxies, if we're talking actually about the Agones integration, would be backed by, we have actually, whatchamacallit, we have Quilkin. They're called agents. They basically say like introspect the information that's of the game servers that are happening on the Agones system. You can write your own as well. That's totally a thing. But for examples, and introspects the game servers themselves, looks at their annotations, is like, oh, this game server has these tokens attached to it. Cool. I'll take that information, send that back up to the proxies, aggregate it all on the way up. And so when those packets come into those proxies, they go, okay, what endpoints do I have that matches off to where my game servers are? What tokens are attached to those? Okay, I have a token for this particular player. Cool. I know to send it to that endpoint because that information can now flow all the way through, and it runs through a series of proxies. And the player data gets routed to the game server without actually knowing any of the information about what the infrastructure looks like behind. So you get some nice information sharing. And then it does also mean that you can offload things like doing access control or maybe compression or decompression or other fun things like that off of your game server process. But that also means that if you detect that a player is doing something they shouldn't be doing, you revoke that access token, it flows through the proxies. Now they no longer have access. Yeah, they get denied at the front door. And there's other fun things you can do architecturally there. But that's why I do call it a service mesh for game servers, because you're looking at very similar patterns there of like, how often can you access things, and do you have access, and should you? And then we can look at those patterns that way too.
Cool. I want to play.
It's a fun problem. It's super interesting. I really like it. I also feel like it's one of those, and I feel like actually very similar to service mesh. It's like, it's not a problem until you felt that pain. If that makes sense. Like I feel like when I was first looking at stuff like Istio or Linkerd or anything in that kind of space, I was like, do I? Like I'll just let everything talk to everything. Like it'll be fine. And then when you start getting bigger and bigger systems, and you're like, how do I keep track of what's talking to what, and like should it, and how often, or do I want to have like commonality? Like I want to have retries, or I suddenly have 4 clusters and like one of them falls over, like short circuit and goes somewhere else, and like
circuit breakers.
You start hitting those kinds of problems. So it is I feel like one of those problems where you're like, oh, once you hit the pain, you're like, oh, cool, I can see where this is interesting. But until you do, it's kind of like, okay, is the complexity worth it? And so there are, the trade-offs there, man.
Yeah, awesome.
I'll talk about this stuff forever. I will. This stuff is fascinating to me.
Oh, we can listen forever, but we don't have. But we don't have forever. But so, envisioning the future, how do you foresee the role of Kubernetes evolving in the realm of game development?
I think it's just going to continue to grow. I mean, I think we've all seen it, right? Kubernetes is the primary de facto standard for distributed systems at this point in time. I haven't seen any other challengers come up that have sort of tried to sway that. So I think it will continue to grow. And the ecosystem that sits around Kubernetes, I mean, it's so hard to beat that. Right, there's a certain network effect that happens in there. There are some different challenges that happen in games in Agones that are quite different from probably a lot of other workloads. Some workloads anyway. Like for example, like game servers are more churny than say a deployment for a website. They go up, they go down. We put more load on etcd. We have a lot of conversations about etcd. That is the thing we talk about a lot. And some of the interesting challenges therein versus like, if you have a static deployment or something auto-scaled and it doesn't necessarily scale up and down nearly as fast as how much ours might. But again, that might be similar to what you see in sort of batch workloads. So that kind of stuff too. So there are definitely stuff inside Kubernetes itself. Like there's some caps that I've been following for a while that have started to get into alpha now, which are really cool and exciting. And some other initiatives in that space that take some of our pain away. But yeah, I honestly, I can only see it growing unless somebody else comes along and kicks Kubernetes off the perch for distributed systems, which, who knows?
There will in the future maybe be a next evolution of...
Who knows? Or yes. At this point, I don't see anything better, but I'm not that smart. So, there are other smarter people in the world. But yeah, Kubernetes, it kind of does. I mentioned this at the beginning. It does blow me away just how much extensibility really is built into Kubernetes and the initial design that allowed for that. The fact that right, like you put a CRD in and it says game server means that when I go to my kubectl client, I can go kubectl get game servers. and it'll autocomplete for me and all that stuff. Like I don't have to do any of that work. Like that's so cool. Like it's just so cool. Like that first moment when I did that, I was like, oh my God, I've just asked Kubernetes to show me all my game servers. Like what? That's amazing. So
as a Linux guy, I like the tab completion. It's so
Right.
awesome. It's
fellow Linux
it's
guy
the
as well.
thing.
What do you run? What Linux distribution?
Ubuntu.
Debian. I run Debian. That's okay. That's fair enough. That's right. Trade-offs.
Well, we have to go now. So before you ask me the question.
Also, long-time Debian user. Xmonad. It's fine. It's good.
Well, I'm from the Windows side
That's
of
okay.
things. So
I have a Windows machine to play games on, so that's fun.
yeah. So what are you guys are you currently playing? What's your favorite game?
I don't know. Favorite. Favorite is a hard one. I just finished the PC port of The Last of Us Part 1, the remaster.
After all the updates, I hope.
Yeah. I waited a while. No, it was a good experience. It was actually a really good experience. An amazing game. I'm primarily a PC game player and like a little bit of mobile, a little bit of Switch. So just finished that, and I play a ton of Marvel Snap on my phone, probably more than is healthy.
Yeah.
What are you playing?
Nice. At the moment, I'm playing Diablo 4
Oh yeah,
with
nice.
some guys every evening, and I'm a big Sonic fanboy, so I play also with
nice.
I play all the Sonic games. I forgot the whole room. You can see the
Oh,
poster
very cool. Yeah, I
beside
see it in the
me.
background. Yep.
Well, Jan, you play a lot of Minecraft, I know.
Yeah, I played a lot of Minecraft.
Oh, very cool.
I like Minecraft. I like the to automate things. So
Right.
I've got a gold farm. I've got a iron farm. I've got all sorts of farms.
Playing a lot of crafting stuff. Yeah, I struggle with it. Personally, I struggle with those kinds of games. They're a little too open-ended, but I do love a story. The funny thing is I work on multiplayer tech and I just don't really play multiplayer games.
I play with
give me
my
a
children.
protagonist,
There's a
a
nice story
character,
there.
and a story. Yeah.
Yeah. I know.
I play with my children, so that's awesome.
Oh,
They
that's
play
lovely.
Minecraft also, so
That's brilliant.
So yeah,
Yeah,
thank you very
Mark,
much.
Thank you very much. Where can
My
people
pleasure.
find
Thank you.
you?
I'm using social media a little sparingly these days, but if you want to find me, a link tree of Mark Mandel is probably the best bet across pretty much everything from whatever Twitter's calling itself these days, Mastodon, Blue Sky, LinkedIn. I think I've got a Polywork somewhere, et cetera. So go find me there. I may return at some point. Who knows?
Maybe when at the KubeCon. Maybe,
Yeah,
we can meet you there.
I will. It's possible. I
It's
spoke at KubeCon EU early this year. May end up at KubeCon NA next year would probably be the most likely.
Yeah, Paris. It's a good reason to go.
Yeah, but
There we go.
US
Yeah, I
probably.
don't know. Yeah, I don't know if I'll end up at KubeCon EU again next year. Definitely see me at Game Developers Conference, and then probably some other gaming events throughout the year.
Okay. Thanks
Thank you
again
very
for
much.
taking your time to have a chat with us. And
My pleasure.
we're going to follow Agones and Quilkin with a lot of interest in the future. So
Brilliant.
hope to talk to you again.
Awesome. Anytime.
Thank you.
Deze podcast is een initiatief van ACC ICT en wij zijn te beluisteren op onze website k8spodcast.nl, via Spotify, Apple, Google Podcast en alle andere favoriete podcastproviders.